Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the window, and everything appeared normal. Peppa stretched and yawned, looking over at George, who was still sleeping peacefully in the bottom bunk. But something felt different today. As Peppa climbed down from her bed, she noticed that her reflection in the bedroom mirror seemed to move just a fraction of a second after she did. She stopped and stared at the mirror, but her reflection appeared perfectly normal now. George stirred and opened his eyes, but when he looked at Peppa, his usual cheerful expression was replaced by something else entirely. George's eyes had changed. They were still the same size and shape, but they seemed darker somehow, as if shadows had crept into them during the night. When he smiled at Peppa, his grin stretched just a little too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Her back was turned to the children as they entered, and she was humming a tune that Peppa had never heard before. The melody was strange and unsettling. When Mummy Pig turned around, her smile was as warm as always, but her eyes had the same dark quality that Peppa had noticed in George. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper at the breakfast table, but the pages were completely blank. He turned each empty page with great interest, occasionally chuckling at invisible jokes. When Peppa pointed this out, Daddy Pig looked at her with confusion and insisted that he was reading the most fascinating article. The house itself began to feel different as the morning progressed. Rooms seemed to be in slightly different places than they were the day before. The hallway appeared longer, and doors that Peppa was certain led to familiar rooms now opened onto spaces she had never seen before. One door revealed a room filled entirely with mirrors, each one showing a slightly different version of whoever looked into them. By afternoon, more friends had arrived to play, but they too had changed. Susie Sheepswool had turned a shade of gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The playground where they usually played had transformed overnight. The swings moved by themselves in the still air, creaking with a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered words. As evening approached, the changes became more pronounced. The sun set in the wrong direction, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. The familiar yellow house on the hill had developed extra windows that glowed with an inner light. When bedtime arrived, Peppa and George climbed into their beds as usual, but sleep would not come easily. The house creaked and settled around them, but the sounds were different now, more deliberate. The last thing Peppa remembered before finally drifting off to sleep was the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their room. These weren't the familiar footsteps of Mummy or Daddy Pig. These steps were lighter, more numerous, as if many small feet were walking back and forth throughout the night.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday when Peppa discovered the old music box in Grandpa Pig's attic. The tiny ballerina inside spun slowly to a melody that seemed strangely familiar, yet wrong somehow. When Peppa wound it up, the tune played backwards, and the ballerina's painted smile looked more like a grimace. That night, Peppa heard the music box playing by itself downstairs. She crept down to find it sitting on the kitchen table, though she was certain she had left it in her room. The ballerina was spinning faster now, and with each turn, the house seemed to change slightly. The family photos on the walls showed different faces, still the Pig family, but their expressions were cold and distant. George woke up crying, but when Peppa went to comfort him, she found his room completely empty. Not just George was gone, his bed, his toys, even the wallpaper had changed to a pattern she didn't recognize. When she called for Mummy and Daddy, their voices answered from somewhere far away, as if they were calling from the bottom of a deep well. The music box melody grew louder, echoing through the house from every room at once. Peppa followed the sound, but each door she opened led to a room that shouldn't exist. A library filled with books that had no words, just blank pages that rustled like whispers. A dining room where the table was set for a family of shadows. The other Peppa in the mirror began to move independently, pressing her hands against the glass from the inside. She mouthed words that Peppa couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "Let me out, and I'll let you in." The music box tune reached a crescendo, and suddenly every mirror in the house showed the same scene. Dozens of other Peppas, all pressing against the glass, all wanting to trade places. Peppa realized that the music box wasn't just playing a tune, it was playing with reality itself. Each note rearranged something in the house, something in her world. The ballerina wasn't dancing, she was conducting an orchestra of impossibilities. And with each spin, the barrier between Peppa's world and the mirror world grew thinner. When morning came, Mummy Pig found Peppa standing in front of the hallway mirror, perfectly still. She was smiling, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The music box sat silent on the table, its ballerina frozen mid-spin. And if you looked very carefully at any mirror in the house, you might catch a glimpse of another little pig, pressing her hands against the glass, trying desperately to get back home. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a rainy evening when Peppa and George discovered something strange in their attic. While playing hide-and-seek, George found an old wooden box covered in cobwebs. When they opened it together, they found old family photographs that looked exactly like theirs, but something was terribly wrong. In these photographs, their family looked the same, but their eyes were completely black, like empty holes. The house looked identical to theirs, but the windows were boarded up and the garden was dead. Most disturbing of all, there was an extra family member in every photo. A tall, thin figure standing behind them with a wide, unnatural smile. Peppa tried to show the photographs to Mummy Pig, but when she looked at them, they appeared completely normal. The same happened with Daddy Pig. Only Peppa and George could see the dark eyes and the mysterious figure lurking in the background. That night, Peppa heard strange scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. She woke George, and together they followed the sounds through the house. The scratching led them to the living room, where they discovered that all the family portraits on the walls had changed. Their faces in the pictures now had the same black, empty eyes. The scratching grew louder and seemed to be coming from behind the largest family portrait above the fireplace. As they watched in horror, the frame began to bulge outward. The glass cracked with a sharp sound that echoed through the silent house. Suddenly, a long, pale hand emerged from the portrait, followed by the tall figure from the photographs. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a broken puppet. Its smile was impossibly wide, and its black eyes seemed to absorb all the light in the room. The figure spoke in a voice that sounded like their own voices mixed together. It told them that it had been waiting in the photographs for so long, watching their family, and now it wanted to take their place. Every night, it would replace one family member in the photographs, and eventually, it would replace them in real life too. Peppa grabbed George's hand, and they ran upstairs, but when they reached their bedroom, they found that all their toys had changed. Their teddy bears now had the same black eyes, and their blocks had formed strange patterns on the floor that filled them with dread. The figure appeared in their doorway, its smile even wider than before. It began to change shape, sometimes looking like Mummy Pig, sometimes like Daddy Pig, but always with those terrible black eyes. It told them that soon, everyone would have black eyes. As the figure reached toward them, Peppa noticed that their own reflections in the bedroom mirror were beginning to change. Their eyes were slowly turning dark. The figure laughed and told them that soon they would join the family in the photographs, trapped forever behind the glass. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when Peppa noticed something strange about her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The reflection smiled back at her, but Peppa wasn't smiling. She blinked, and for a moment the reflection didn't blink back. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the living room when he heard whispers coming from the walls. The whispers spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but somehow he knew they were calling his name. Mummy Pig was preparing dinner in the kitchen when all the family photos on the wall began to change. In each picture, the family's smiles became wider and wider, stretching beyond what should be possible. Their eyes grew darker, like empty holes staring back at her. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper in his favorite chair when the words on the pages started rearranging themselves, spelling out messages that made no sense, yet filled him with inexplicable dread. That night, Peppa couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear footsteps in the hallway. But when she looked, no one was there. The footsteps were small, like a child's, but they moved in a rhythm that didn't match any normal walking pattern. George's room was across the hall, and she could see his door was slightly open. Through the crack, she glimpsed something moving in the darkness that was too tall to be George. The next morning, the family gathered for breakfast, but something was wrong with their shadows. While they sat at the table eating, their shadows on the wall were standing up, moving independently, reaching toward each other with elongated arms. Peppa tried to tell her parents, but when she spoke, her voice came out as someone else's whisper. At playgroup, Susie Sheep noticed that Peppa's eyes had changed color overnight. They were still brown, but there was something else behind them, something that watched and waited. During playtime, all the toys in the room began moving on their own, arranging themselves in perfect circles around the children. The teacher, Madame Gazelle, smiled her usual smile, but her reflection in the window showed something entirely different. When the family returned home that evening, they found that their house had gained an extra room. A door that had never been there before stood at the end of the upstairs hallway. Behind the door, they could hear the sound of children playing, but the voices didn't belong to Peppa or George. The voices belonged to children who sounded exactly like them, but spoke words they had never said. As night fell, the Pig family realized they were no longer alone in their house. There were others now, others who looked just like them, but weren't quite right. These others lived in the mirrors, in the shadows, in the spaces between the walls. And slowly, very slowly, they were beginning to take over, one reflection at a time.